so grateful to have with us J Sai Deepak to discuss understanding Indian democracy, Ambedkar secularism, and the state. My name is Parth. I'm currently a graduate student at Princeton University and director of advocacy for Hindu Students Council, which is a Hindu organization working in the US. And I'm joined by my dear friend Indu, who I must also express gratitude for because she invited me to co-moderate this discussion with her. Indu, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a doctoral student as well in teacher education at Teachers College, Columbia, and also a Hindu American mother. And so all of these things touch upon my interests. I'm also just a highly opinionated and curious person.
Amazing. So we're, as I mentioned, really grateful to be joined today by J Sai Deepak. So many of you may know him already, but I'll just briefly provide an introduction. So J Sai Deepak is an Indian constitutional lawyer who is perhaps most notable for the work that he did on the Sabrimala case in 2018 in the Supreme Court. Many of you may have seen his videos and commentary on the Citizenship Amendment Act from this past year as well. J Sai Deepak graduated from Anna University with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. And he then went on to pursue an LLB from IIT Kharagpur. And he said he took this decision after political discourse took a sharp turn and gradually transformed into self-loathing and self-hatred in a systematic manner. So we'll definitely be getting into some of these topics throughout the discussion today. J Sai Deepak, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
Wonderful. Before we start, I just wanted to frame the conversation. The origin story of this conversation is that I've been a fan of your work for so long, and just how clearly you articulate and incisively you kind of cut through a lot of rhetoric and narrative. And there was a lot of narrative happening that I'm seeing in the media here, on college campuses here, just sort of in the public consciousness. And while I have sort of a general idea that some of it feels off, I have a need to, and I feel like a lot of people feel a need to sort of verify this with an actual deep understanding of Indian democracy and the Constitution, and how much of this is conjecture and rhetoric and how much of it is actually possible even. So it's sort of, for me, it's like a Indian democracy 101 that I felt a need for, and I kind of felt like a lot of people could benefit from. So that's sort of the origin story. And you were generous enough to get on the phone with me. We had a lovely conversation, and then you suggested this live conversation so that everyone could sort of participate, and that this wasn't just sort of a canned speech on Indian democracy. So really, really grateful and appreciative of that. So the framework for this conversation is that it's to touch on issues that are pervasive in both Indian and diaspora communities, questions and concerns about the contemporary Indian political landscape. It's not an attempt to advance any particular political party or organization. It is a conversation for everyone to understand and have a clear understanding of Indian laws, the Constitution, and how they relate to the dominant narrative, maybe even specifically in the United States, about India as a democracy.
Since April 14th is also Ambedkar Jayanti, we also wanted to link some of these ideas back to Dr. Ambedkar, since he, after all, is the author of the Indian Constitution, and his theories about Indian democracy. We'll allow everybody who's on Facebook, watching this on Facebook Live, to comment their questions into the video feed. So if you have a question about anything that we ask J Sai Deepak or anything that J Sai Deepak says, feel free to comment your question into the video feed, and we'll do our best to be able to get to as many questions as we possibly can. Today, we're going to be dividing the interview into different segments. So if you could keep your question germane to the segment that we're on, that would really help us out a lot. So Indu, would you like to kick us off?
Sure.
And get started?
Sure. So you are currently one of the most incisive and celebrated by many of us constitutional lawyers in India, but you were once an engineer. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what got you interested in pursuing a legal career.
So the one thing that the field of litigation does is that it makes you extremely aware of where you stand in the pecking order, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So when I say this, I don't intend to feign false modesty, but I don't think I'm celebrated, nor do I believe I'm an expert in constitutional law. I've said this before, see myself genuinely and honestly as a student of constitutional law who continues to get opportunities to put it in action as part of my work. So in that sense, I can certainly claim to have a reasonable amount of experience under my belt, but I don't know if that makes me either celebrated, renowned, or an expert. Second, as far as my transition to the legal profession is concerned, I think I was largely looking for something that allows me to interact with the public with some degree of training, professional training, either in the humanities or specifically a program such as law that educates me on how the system works, what are its schematic, what is its schematic design, so to speak, and not just understand it, but also highlight certain structural flaws if I ever became capable of it, so to speak. So that coupled with an extremely polarized atmosphere between 2004 to 2006, which is when I think there was a serious political transition, but I don't think political transition affected me. It was more of the ideological transition and the amount of vitriol, venom, and poison that was being spewed on campuses if you held certain beliefs or if you identified yourself with a certain ideological position, so to speak. And that's when I decided that I must contribute to the discourse in some way and disrupt it in a positive way if possible. And I wasn't sure of the way that I wanted to adopt to do it. And I think as fate or destiny would have it, I was exposed to this program called the Bachelor's in Law with a specialization in intellectual property rights, which was making its debut in 2006 in IIT Kharagpur. And that's when I made the transition. And not a day goes by when I don't thank Providence or destiny or God for helping me make that decision or the transition. And I've been grateful ever since. And each day since I think that must be August 2006, I think I've spent reveling in the subject called the law, because it has opened my eyes to its connections to history, its connections to politics, culture, civilization, and whatnot. So I think you're less of a lawyer if you believe only in the law and you don't read beyond the law. So that's where I see myself.
Amazing. So the first question I wanted to get into for the actual substance of our conversation was, you've written extensively about this distinction between a civilizational state and a nation state, and have made the case that India is a civilization state. Can you explain to our listeners and viewers what is exactly the difference is, and what are the implications of that difference?
As an intellectual property lawyer, the first thing that I'm taught is not to take credit for somebody else's ideas. So I must make this very, very clear that I don't consider myself as the pioneer of this discourse when it comes to seeing India as a civilizational state. Several stalwarts have done this. I'm merely trying to climb on their shoulders. Sri Aurobindo, Swami Vivekananda, each of these people, notwithstanding their spiritual moorings, given their active interest in India's national life and political life and civilizational life, so to speak, saw India as a civilizational state, as the successor of a civilization, so to speak. And the reason why they saw themselves as the successor of a civilization as opposed to a nation state is because of the journey, the sheer volume and quality of journey that this civilization has traversed. Which has allowed multiple expressions of individual identities, sub-identities as part of this umbrella. So that is what fundamentally separates a civilization from a nation state, which is, so for instance, while it is debatable, and I don't think I'm an expert on the subject, as to whether Sanskrit is the mother of all languages in India, but you can certainly hear Sanskrit in several languages in India. But that doesn't take away from the individual beauty and literary richness and expression of each of these languages, which effectively shows that each of these languages and the cultures associated with it, the idiom and everything, has had a lot of time to express itself and gain its own sense of individualism. And if that be the case, that it clearly shows that there are multiple cultures which have their own diverse expressions, which are tied by an underlying unity. There is a common underpinning there, which is the textbook definition of a civilization. It is not monochromatic. At the same time, its diversity is not fissiparous in nature. It ultimately beats as one, it reacts as one, it thinks as one, without any external imposition. It comes from within. So that is what makes Bharat, according to me, a civilizational state. That's very distinct from a nation state. So for instance, Europe has not, or let's say European nationalism has not been built on the basis of a civilization state. Europe itself may see itself as a civilization, but each country within Europe sees itself as a nation state, which identifies either with the French identity that traces itself back to Gaul, or it sees itself as, let's say, the successor nation of a Germanic identity, and then traces itself to the unification of Germany to 1871 and whatnot. But the thing about a nation state is that at best there are one or two yardsticks on the basis of which, or building blocks on the basis of which you build your identity. The civilization is so vast that it's almost impossible to use a single lens to define its identity, because of the journey, and second, that it has blossomed in multiple ways. And depending on which side you choose to view it from, you might end up giving importance to that particular side. So if you focus on language, you'll think about language. If you focus on culture, you think of culture. But no one single aspect defines the whole. That is the vastness of the concept of a civilization. And I think if there is ever a country which fits the definition of a civilization state, I wouldn't even call China a civilizational state, while it may call itself a civilization state. I would say India is one. And notwithstanding the Judeo-Abrahamic origins of the United States, thanks to the melting pot that it has become, at least over the last 60 to 70 years, it can lay claim to being a civilizational state in the future, if not now. So I think that's where I draw my distinction. And I've had the benefit of reading several stalwart giants in this particular field, starting from Tilak to people I've named. And among the contemporary scholars, I think three people that I have actually read extensively to make the case is Dr. Konrad Elst, Dr. Sitaram Goel. Among my contemporaries, in fact, there's one brilliant professor of economics, Mr. Abhinav Prakash, whose work is fantastic and it's path-breaking. And the fact that he is a JNU survivor who's managed to make a case for India as a civilizational state speaks volumes for itself and his convictions. So these are the people that I typically draw my sources from, having applied the filter of my own independent thinking and agreeing with them. So that's where I started.
Great. Wow, that's a lot to chew on.
Long answers.
No, it's amazing. You give like half an hour in 5 minutes. It's fantastic. Our next question is very related to this. One of the most contested words in Indian politics is secularism. It appears in the preamble of the Indian Constitution. What does secularism mean in the Indian constitutional framework, and how is that different from that of Western countries like the United States?
You'll have to pardon me if I get a bit clinical here. So secularism as a word in the Indian preamble is a relatively late entrant to the preamble and must necessarily trace its origins to the amendments undertaken during the period of emergency. So it's surprising that people who associate Indian emergency, I think 1975 to 77, as a dark phase in India, don't seem to want to call the introduction of secularism as a dark phase in Indian history. That's surprising, and that's a bit of, that's an irony. Second, even before secularism as a word found mention in the preamble to the Constitution, the word secular did exist. So the word secular is different in its connotation the moment you suffix it with the ism, because the moment it becomes secularism, it takes a life of its own. But secular in itself is a clear distinction between what is religious and what is not religious. Okay. Now, the moment it takes the shape of an ism, then frankly speaking, I don't think there is a single definition, and each of these concepts is capable of assuming a certain definition depending on the circumstance and the country of its birth. Okay. So secularism in the context of European history and their, let's call it denominational wars, so to speak, it has a different connotation altogether. Okay. Secularism in the context of United States perhaps has a different context altogether. Secularism in the context of India, according to me, has a very, very different context, and I certainly don't agree with the brand of secularism that is that most of our modern leaders swear by. Let me first define it in a negative way as to what it is not, and then explain what I think it is. One, I certainly don't think secularism requires Bharat to abandon its civilizational identity under any circumstances. And it is owing to its civilizational identity that it believes in fair treatment of all faiths which lead to the divine consciousness. Okay, and therefore this takes you to the second point of departure, which is anybody who believes that secularism is to be traced to the constitution doesn't realize that the constitution itself traces the concept of secularism to the native pulse of the land and not to ether. Okay. 3, I don't see a conflict between India's embracing of its civilizational identity and its promise of fairness and equal treatment to all faiths. In fact, if anything, its allegiance to its native identity requires it to treat people fairly. Okay. 4, I do believe that the constitutional understanding of secularism must always be in the context of history and the circumstances that informed the framing of the constitution. Okay, and if you go through the Constant Assembly debates, it tells you for a fact that while it was proposed during the course of the drafting of the constitution that India shall not have a religion of its own, which was one of the draft clauses proposed for adoption, formal adoption, nobody wants to tell you that it was never finally adopted. Okay. Therefore, when people try and impose a certain definition on secularism, which was rejected outright during the course of the Constant Assembly debates, I find it extremely surprising that a rejected clause is being treated as the sacrosanct definition of secularism. Okay. So you don't need to be an expert in constitutional law or constitutional interpretation to understand that if something stands rejected, you can't use it to draw support to a position. Okay, so secularism, according to me, is India, for all practical purposes, is a dharmic state. And the word dharma is not a word that people like me choose to impose and infuse in the constitution. It figures significantly in multiple debates during the discussions on what is India's take on morality. Because in the United States, there's a specific breed of legislation called the morals legislation, where legislation is brought in by the state in the name of morality to curb certain practices, be it, let's say, the ban on cigarette or child pornography or whatnot, or incest or whatever, bestiality or whatever you call it. Okay, so when discussions were being held in India as to what must we trace our definitions of morality to, the resounding answer was dharma, dharma, and dharma alone, notwithstanding the fact that the United States Constitution, the Yugoslavian Constitution, the German Constitution, the unwritten Constitution of United Kingdom were among the constitutions which we referred to during the crafting of this document. Okay. So there's a common uninformed allegation that is hurled against Dr. Ambedkar that he merely copy-pasted provisions from other countries, let's say the Irish Constitution and the Government of India Act of 1935, and that it was not original. In fact, this was a question that was specifically put to him during the course of the debates, and he said, I don't see what is the problem in adopting a certain provision and then giving it an Indian twist, as long as you're not able to make a case out that the provision is inherently against the pulse of this country. Okay, so I think in a way he was restating, I think, what is that Upanishadic principle that wherever good ideas come from, you're supposed to adopt them. Okay, so in that sense, the Constitution obviously is a fair mix of what was found abroad and deemed worthy of adoption, coupled with a fair room for Indianization, which is what most lawyers would call autochthonization, which is to say localized application of a foreign principle. Okay, so therefore, according to me, secularism, when applied in the Indian context, must be done in the backdrop of dharma, in the backdrop of its civilizational identity, and specifically in the backdrop of the bloody partition of 1947.
There's a lot to get to in your answer that we're going to get to, especially the misrepresentations of Dr. Ambedkar, which happened. That's the next section of our interview. But before that, I wanted to go to a question from a viewer, Ketan Goswamiji. He asks, as you alluded to, the word secularism was added to the Constitution of India during the emergency, can that be removed to the previous version? And do you think that that would actually be a helpful change?
Frankly speaking, its existence or removal would not take away from the Constitution's fundamental secular impulse. The problem lies in its interpretation by courts. The problem lies in its interpretation in popular discourse. The problem lies in the motivated and uninformed nonsense that is peddled and pushed in, let's say, mainstream media, its publications, so on and so forth. What could be done, I would say, is as opposed to removing it from the Constitution altogether, perhaps it could be clarified and its scope could be limited or restricted with the clarification that the use of secularism or the presence of secularism in the Constitution does not mean that India does not have a civilizational identity of its own. Okay, that clarification would go a long way in addressing a lot of ills in public discourse that we get to see and hear often. So I don't think removing it sends a good message as well, because you don't live in a silo anymore. And from the standpoint of optics and from the standpoint of India's reputation in the, let's say, global order, so to speak, I don't think India should come across as a narrow-minded nation. It has never. And therefore, it must clarify it to ensure that while it seeks to preserve its indigenous native identity, it promises to be fair, reasonable, and equal in its treatment to other faiths as well, or other identities as well, so long as it does not seek to undermine or undercut the native identity.
I want to ask a follow-up question that you've kind of just answered, but I just want to have it on the record. Yeah. So there is this debate on secularism, which I think to some in the West is stunning. How can any democracy contest this concept of secularism? Right. So just for the record, is the freedom to practice any religion or no religion at all under threat in India right now?
So, in fact, I'd like to address this with reference to the provision, and for the benefit of the participants, let me just read out the provision that deals with right to freedom of religion, subject to public order, morality, and health, and to other provisions of this part, which is the part that deals with fundamental rights, that's part 3. All persons are equally entitled to freedom of conscience and the right freely to profess, practice, and propagate religion. Okay, so the focus is first on freedom of conscience, and therefore the corollary to that would be freedom of thought. Okay, and therefore the freedom to practice and profess and propagate religion. Let me break up your question into 3 parts. One, I believe that there is a strong axiomatic school of thought in the US which believes that democracy is the norm, and as part of democracy, secularism is the norm if you're a democratic nation. Frankly, I believe it is a myopic understanding of history, because both democracy and secularism as we understand it are, frankly, to put it in Indian lingo, bachas, relatively kids in the course of world history. Okay, and there's a decent chance that the attempt to export certain definitions of democracy and freedom of religion will teach a lot more countries to accept with humility that there are multiple ways of living and multiple ways of administration depending on the basic nature and tendencies of a certain nation or a people. Okay, I think that is the increasing realization. Second, if people proceed on the assumption that secularism, in the sense that the state is not supposed to have a religion of its own, is at loggerheads with democracy itself, if that were to be the proposition, I think the best counterfactuals would be the United Kingdom and Israel. Because the Anglican Church is seen as the, let's say, the formal church which disseminates or which projects the English identity. While they don't say it, most conservative, let's say, thought leaders of UK, when they speak of the Britishness or the identity of Britishness, they are effectively subscribing to those ideals professed by the Anglican Church. Most importantly, the Anglican Church has a constitutional role in the administrative scheme of the United Kingdom. Okay, the Archbishop of Canterbury, I assume, has a position in the House of Lords. Okay, and that has not stopped us from thinking of the United Kingdom as a relatively secular country, and nobody questions the freedom of religion available in the United Kingdom. Okay. Second, Israel, for all practical purposes, was a Jewish state at its inception. And after the adoption of the nation-state laws, I think about 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, nobody's been left in any doubt about its Jewish identity. Okay, but I don't think there has been a single report which casts aspersions in the Jewish state's treatment of non-Jews within the state of Israel. Okay, while there could be any amount of controversy and debate surrounding their treatment of Palestinians or their relationship with the idea of Palestine, I don't think anybody can question their treatment of Palestinian Arabs of Muslim faith within the state of Israel, okay? Or Christians for that matter, or Druzes for that matter, or even a fair number of Hindus living in Israel for that matter, Indians living in that particular state, okay? So I fundamentally disagree with the proposition that democracy has anything to do with adoption of secularism. It may be a chance of history that perhaps they've gone hand in hand, or maybe they've gone hand in hand in those countries which have defined the narrative. Assume for a moment that democracy and secularism did not go hand in hand in Europe and United States. Would we be speaking of both these concepts in the same breath as we are now? I don't think so. Okay. So since the dominant narrative is decided by who calls the shots at the table of big powers, okay, it's perfectly understandable for them to project their point of view as the normal, but I reject them, and I believe that not everybody needs to accept those points of view, and we are entitled to define for ourselves these values depending on conditions we live in.
There's some questions coming in from viewers.
Now that we know that secularism can be undermined, you had mentioned that it could be codified specifically what it is. How would you go about doing that specifically? And how can we make sure that this type of erosion of secularism, so that there is a common understanding amongst everybody about what it actually means within India? How can we make sure that that kind of happens? That's a question from Narasimha Birreddy. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so before I answer that question, I think I should answer the second part of Induji's question, which I think will address this as well, which was whether secularism in India is under threat. That was the question. I don't believe it's under threat. I simply believe that what we are seeing right now is a rejection of, let's say, an artificial imposition of a manufactured definition by, let's say, significant cross-sections of the Indian society. And therefore, obviously, you're seeing a shift in the status quo, a change in the paradigm, which may not be to the liking of those who would want to preserve the status quo for multiple reasons, okay? And if those, let's say, proponents of status quo have connections, let's say, in influential sections of Western media, that manages to reach the eyes and ears of, let's say, the readers in America or other parts of the world. That is in no way proof of undermining of secularism in India. India was a civilizational state with a secular impulse at its heart, and it continues to be so. What we are seeing right now is the, let's say, perhaps we are looking at setting a few inequities right, which have crept in as a consequence of, let's say, political machinations and other machinations. So I don't think secularism in India is under any kind of threat whatsoever. Okay. If anything, over the last 4.5 to 6 years, I think the budget outlay could actually lead some of us to wonder as to whether there is a disproportionate skew in allocation of funds on the basis of religion to religious minorities, which as a constitutional lawyer, or at least a practitioner of the constitutional law, I would even question its constitutionality. Okay, whether this kind of a treatment without any basis being created on the basis of affirmative action, would it not amount to favoring a particular section on the basis of religion? Okay, that's one. Now coming to your question, what would be the operational steps or the specific steps to right the wrong with respect to secularism? Either you put faith in the judiciary to take up this issue as and when it presents itself as part of a case, which is too much of an unknown and it's riddled with uncertainties, or the government must show the political will to say that this particular concept seems to be dominating our headlines and newspapers day in and day out. And it has the tendency to divide the public, and it does not allow for an honest conversation, because terms such as bigotry, bigot, fundamentalist, whatnot, fascist and everything, they're hurled whenever a discussion is initiated on history, merely because it seems to hurt a few sentiments. So I think if the government were to deem it a priority, which I think it should, they could perhaps move a constitutional amendment to clarify the definition of secularism, or as part of perhaps an explanation to a preamble, which would be unorthodox. But then in India, for all practical purposes, is an unorthodox country today. So as long as it helps set the tone right in terms of public discourse, and also does not threaten the rights of minorities, cultural, religious, and linguistic, I think it's a fairly doable proposition. But that would mean that it has to figure in the list of priorities of the dispensation in power, which I suspect it is not.
Thank you for that. There are a lot of questions asking about further resources and readings, and we'll make sure to link and add those later so that we can get to that. I want to move on to the next section. So this next section, since this is sort of in honor of Ambedkar Jayanti, you and I, when we had spoken, you said that you were going to be sort of addressing a lot of maybe misrepresentations or demystifying some of his ideas. So I didn't know if there were some general things that you wanted to touch upon, or if you wanted me to ask specific questions around that.
So I think while Ambedkar's continued relevance is unquestionable and undeniable, there is a certain degree of deification, which I think is unhealthy if you truly subscribe to Ambedkar's or Dr. Ambedkar's views on rationality and reason. Okay. I don't think anyone should necessarily deify him in the hope of winning a badge of honor to say, yes, I'm an Ambedkarite. Okay, I don't understand that tendency at all. And the second thing is, every human being is necessarily a package of the good, bad, and the ugly. And I don't think there's anyone who's an exception to that. Three, Ambedkar as a person was fundamentally irreverent when it comes to blind deification of either an individual or a concept. And that is something that all of us must adopt. I think that is perhaps a shining example of his Indianness. Okay. I think in that sense, his approach was extremely Vedantic and Upanishadic, where he would not accept something blindly, okay, regardless of who says it or what is being pushed. Four, while he is called as the author of the Indian Constitution, I don't think even he would have agreed with that title, or the sobriquet, so to speak, because the first draft of the Constitution was presented to the committee which was tasked with this particular exercise by the constitutional advisor Sri B.N. Rao. Okay, so any student of social studies or civics will tell you that Dr. Ambedkar was the chairman of the drafting committee, and the drafting committee was made responsible for chiseling the language of the Constitution after having, let's say, a basic structure in place. Okay. So the basic structure, or the, let's say, the basic flesh and blood character of the Constitution was a collective effort, subsequent to which it was sent to the committee headed by Dr. Ambedkar for fine-tuning the language, because ultimately that's what the lawyer does. Okay. So while his contribution to the Constitution is undeniable, we should not inflate it at the expense of the contribution of others, because that would be against the spirit of what he stood for. 5, there are provisions in the Constitution which speak of abolition and which mandate abolition of untouchability, caste-based untouchability. But surprisingly, there is not a single provision that asks for abolition of the caste structure, with Ambedkar being present as part of this entire exercise. Okay. That tells you that, see, here's the important aspect. So he's written books called The Annihilation of Caste, where he's dealt with this issue extensively. But ultimately, it did not translate to any provision of the Constitution which called for abolition of the caste system altogether, or the abolition of the caste identity altogether. There are multiple reasons for it. One, it would have been extremely unfair to those people who perhaps needed to be let's say, who perhaps deserved some kind of an affirmative action. given that they've been at the receiving end of a distortion of the system. Okay. 3, I do believe that Dr. Ambedkar, after his extensive study, perhaps came to the realization that maybe it is not possible to destroy the concept of caste altogether, but you can redefine it as you go along to suit the times and conditions that you live in, which is perhaps more consistent with the basic approach of caste all along. Okay. I don't subscribe to the notion, the so-called notion that the caste structure is entirely based on vocation, profession, and karma. I don't think that's the case at all. That is perhaps an apologia for the caste structure. It has always had an element of nature, guna, karma, and birth associated with it. And to lie would be, let's say, that would be dishonest, intellectually dishonest. Okay. So any decent dissertation of the Gita on this aspect, coupled with the commentaries on the caste structure subsequently, should tell you that birth did play a huge role, and you should not run away from it at all. You must ask yourself what to make of it, and ask yourself, is it relevant in today's times? But most importantly, in these days when there's a lot of talk going on about Dalit Muslim unity, Dr. Ambedkar's views on Islam as a religion, on Islam as a brotherhood, and the concept of two-nation theory, its relevance, and the reality of Pakistan are must read. They're mandatory according to me, because I would believe that if his writings were to be republished under the name of any other author, or if they were to be published as anonymous writings today, there's a decent chance that someone may even call them bigoted or fundamentalist. But I don't think he was either being bigoted or fundamentalist. He was merely presenting them as statements of facts, not truth, statement of facts based on his analysis. Okay. So I think Ambedkar is an extremely relevant personality who must be read, explored, examined, critiqued, but not deified. Okay. So I certainly, I'm still trying to understand this person, who I believe was certainly an intellectual giant. The clarity of his writings is scintillating for anyone who is a man of letters or who is a person of letters, to adopt Justin Trudeau's language. Okay. So I do believe that Ambedkar continues to be relevant. It's unfortunate that the idea of Ambedkar has been hijacked by vested interests to push a false narrative. Okay. He says a lot of things and he does a lot of things which is possible, which makes it possible for us to adopt him in different parts. There's a decent chance that there is something for everyone. But I don't think he was pandering to a gallery at all. Okay, he was merely expressing himself with as much authenticity as possible. So that's something that we must all perhaps try and draw from.
Amazing. Some follow-up questions that I think are specific to the US context in the way that Ambedkar and these sort of Ambedkarite movements that you talk about. Some movements here posit that he suggested that Hinduism, or that use their readings of his theories, that Hinduism itself needs to be destroyed because it can't be salvaged from caste, that there is nothing to Hinduism but caste, and therefore
Right.
Hinduism itself needs to be destroyed. How do you see Ambedkar relating to that?
If that were to be the proposition, as opposed to playing the defensive, I would actually turn the argument around and ask myself this question: would it be possible for Islam and Christianity to survive without their missionary spirit? If it is possible, why don't they abandon the missionary spirit? Because I don't think the allegiance to the supreme deity in which they believe in necessarily calls for a missionary spirit. Okay, so that's a question that must be posed back, according to me. Because if it's possible to sever the idea of Islam and the idea of Christianity from, let's say, the proselytizing aspect of these religions, then why not do so? Because that seems to be the element of those faiths which is causing a lot of trouble in terms of social harmony and order. Okay, that's one. Second, two propositions. Does Hinduism have an identity independent of the caste structure? Two, if the answer is a no, then has the caste structure become irrelevant, thereby rendering irrelevant Hinduism itself? Okay, these are the two levels at which this question must be answered. I think a brilliant book, again, in this regard, is Dr. Ambedkar's own correspondence with Mr. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, which is Annihilation of Caste. And if you look at the history of the publication of this book itself, it is the product of his presidential address to the Jat-Pat Todak Mandal, which had invited him to present his views on reformation of the caste-based evils in Hinduism as part of, I think, that Lahore session. And they asked him to submit his speech for their vetting and review. And he said, if you've invited me, you should let me express myself without censoring the contents and the opinions. Okay. When they said, sorry, we can't do this unless and until we know what is it that you're going to present, because ultimately we don't want a situation where we have a law and order situation at our hands because of your contents. He refused to participate in those proceedings, and he said, I am not going to share the contents. Instead, he decided to convert that into a book. Okay. So the entire book is a correspondence between these two dramatis personae, with Gandhiji jumping in like Narada Muni. Okay. So the conversation ultimately leads to a point where Mr. Gandhi, for once where I agree with him, ends up questioning Dr. Ambedkar for his presumptions as to the integrality of the caste structure to the Hindu faith. Okay. And there, Dr. Ambedkar, as a truly honest intellectual in that sense, ends up saying, if I'm shown literature that says that the caste structure is not the whole and soul of Hinduism, I am happy to change my views. I don't think there's a single person on a specific ideological spectrum who would show that kind of openness and honesty. Okay. So this is one book that I think is a must read to understand the issue better. His entire suggestion in that book was the only way to rid the caste system, or let's say rid the society of the caste system, was destruction of Hinduism. That was his opening premise. And that is the fact that that was his opening position, which during the course of the dialogue and the correspondence, he is forced to retract and he's forced to reconsider. Okay. So while his opening position is given a lot of traction, what he said subsequently and the openness that he showed is something that I would expect these Ambedkarites to show as well, and equip themselves with more information before they vomit their utter uninformed bilge. Okay.
Yeah.
So no, I'm just using my freedom of expression and speech.
Yeah. It's fantastic. So on that same vein, these same Ambedkarite informed movements in the US very readily and for a long time have conflated caste and race. So the same issues of race that are experienced in the US can be mapped onto caste, and they have similar origins and similar purposes and similar commitments, and therefore the struggle is the same.
I think that's the typical Judeo-Abrahamic style of approximation where they cut the head to fit the hat. Okay. So I don't think it has any basis at all. The approach is thoroughly fraudulent and erroneous, to use legal language. Okay. In defining who is a Hindu as part of the constitution, it was certainly done with the endorsement of Dr. Ambedkar that Buddhists shall also be seen as Hindus. Okay. So even when he decided to convert, it is from one branch of Hinduism to the other branch that ultimately Dr. Ambedkar converted, but not out of Hinduism. Okay, he didn't convert to any other faith other than Hinduism. Okay, so I would in fact not even call it conversion, because anyone who follows Indian philosophy will tell you that Buddhism, along with Jainism and Charvakaism, is one of the schools of Nastika thought in Hindu philosophy. Okay. So perhaps from an Astika, he became a Nastika in that particular sense, but he still chose to be within the umbrella head of Hinduism. That's one. Two, the mapping of caste and race, frankly, is untenable. But most importantly, the very use of caste as a substitute for Varna, as a substitute for Jati, itself needs a lot of scholarly analysis. Okay. I'm not in a position to hold forth on what does it actually translate to. That perhaps calls for more expertise from a historian or someone who's read caste better. But I'm sure that the, let's say, the stagnation of the concept of caste because of the use of caste by the British for administrative purposes is significantly responsible for preventing its evolution, okay? And therefore preventing our own understanding of how it should have ultimately evolved. Because you see, I believe that most Indian systems have a self-correcting mechanism, that even in the absence of an external stimulus, assuming for a moment that it has reached the peak of its dirt, it will automatically start walking down the bell curve and reach, let's say, a place of balance, a place of equilibrium, so to speak, okay? And the sad part is the Indian state's continued adherence to the British definitions of caste. So I think there's a lot more room for indigenous research on the concept of caste. But to equate it with race is to endorse that fraudulent theory called the Aryan invasion theory, okay? And I don't think anyone who's read Dr. Sitaram Goel or Dr. Meenakshi Jain or Dharampal or Ram Swaroop or any of these stalwarts can ever agree, or even Mr. or Dr. Shrikant Talageri can agree with the racist approach or the racial approach to the concept of Aryan, okay? In my limited understanding, I believe that perhaps over a point, the creature that we know as Hinduism is certainly a product of assimilation of several subcultures and identities. But I don't think it had a racial basis to it. It perhaps had a civilizational basis to it, where one advanced section of the society was perhaps trying to educate other parts of the society and ultimately realized that perhaps their approach was wrong, which is why the Chaturvarna system is a system which is largely used for the villages and the cities. But when it comes to those parts which are not strictly civilization, the term that was used was Panchama, which is you're outside the Chaturvarna system. And therefore, the Adivasis and all these jatis, so to speak, were to be treated as Panchamas. And the rules of the city and the village would not apply to their style and ways of living. The reason was they ultimately realized that the hunter-gathering communities and all these communities are central for survival of the ecosystem, for nature. Okay, and their ways of living must not be interfered with. So contrary to, let's say, the missionary approach of Jesuits who try to preach and who try to civilize and educate tribals in India and other places, we chose not to do that only for one reason, because I think we realized that it was elitist and racist, perhaps, to teach them or try to educate them because they know something that we don't know. And their circumstances are very, very different. Which is why I said, while I know for a fact that the adoption of the caste-race conflation is motivated and is meant to, let's say, further a certain secessionist agenda in India, I don't believe that we have understood caste itself with the level of depth that we ought to have by now. So there's a lot more room for scholarship there.
Yeah, for sure. There's many, many great questions coming in, but we do have to move on because we know your time is valuable and limited. The next section that we wanted to discuss with you was about equality and discrimination within the Indian Constitution. So one thing that you've been mentioning is the annihilation of caste. And in that book, Ambedkar mentions liberty, equality, and fraternity as three ideals in his perfect society. How are the citizens of India differentiated by religion or caste in any legal way?
So I think what has happened is the Constitution is seen as the product of a Nehruvian mindset. Okay. And I think it is historically incorrect. The Constitution is not the product of a Nehruvian mindset. The Nehruvian mindset came much after the coming into force of the Constitution. Okay. And the Nehruvian mindset dominated the the institutions of India, the Academy of India, especially the history departments of India. And therefore, today, when we look at the Constitution, we assume and retrospectively project Nehruvianism to the Constitution. Okay, that's the mistake that we commit. Okay, so we have to first of all agree on one basic fact, that the Constitution, notwithstanding its pluses and minuses, is not reflective of the Nehruvian Marxist model that came into existence subsequently. Okay. Two, what is the relevance of this particular proposition to your question? The majority-minority divide. Okay. The concept of minorities, as discussed in the Constitution, is not limited to religious minorities. The language of that particular provision, Article 29, Article 30, itself speaks of linguistic and cultural minorities, and therefore, by definition, it's a state-based head count. Okay, because if you're a cultural minority or a religious minority, it obviously depends on the geography and the place where you exist. Okay, so depending on the political unit under consideration, these definitions and terms have to be applied. Two, it is assumed that the Constitution guarantees and bestows the minorities with a greater set of rights than the majority. This is a liberal slant to the Constitution, which has got no basis in constitutional theory and goes against the concept of equality, which is what they constantly scream and shout about. Okay, if on one hand you claim to be a proponent of equality, and on the other hand you also clamor for more rights for minorities on the basis of a religious identity, you're at loggerheads with Proposition 1. Okay. Two, in the backdrop of the partition, and in the backdrop of the tension and the baggage of partition, the country decided that it is important to specify those rights of the minorities which are assumed to vest with the majority. Okay, so the specific provisions in the Constitution which deal with minority rights are merely a reflection of the assumed rights of the majority. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the Constitution gives an extra set of rights to minorities. Okay, so there is and I think I've mentioned this book before in one of my recent discussions. It's called The Cultural Defense of Nations, A Liberal Theory of Majority Rights, published by Oxford Constitutional Publication and written by this scholar called Leah Vorgad, I think an Israeli scholar of Jewish origin, where he completely supports this with a lot of theoretical arguments. So to answer your question, the problem today is the conflation of minority with the religious minority. The problem today is the understanding that minority rights automatically translate to greater set of autonomy and freedoms to religious minorities than majority, which has no basis in any liberal or conservative theory, legal theory. Okay, I think that needs to be busted, and it needs to be said as loud and clearly as possible. Unfortunately, those who shout against minority appeasement don't read enough to support it with enough arguments. I mean, if they've done their reading, there's enough and more to actually kill this entire thing. There's a lot of ammunition.
Okay, so there's a lot there, and I wanted to ask you a few lightning round follow-up questions. Are you okay with that?
Yes, please. I'll keep my answer short.
Sure. So in India, does the law identify people by religion or caste and deny them any type of constitutional rights on that basis?
See, when it comes to certain kinds of reservations which have been introduced on the basis of religion, they do. And these are discriminatory legislations which have been, I think, which are under challenge. So while the Constitution does not allow for such laws, unless and until there is a clear justification on an economic basis, by and large, what has happened over a point of time is pampering of vote banks through such schemes. And there are any number of dispensations which have resorted to this. And I don't think there's a single dispensation which is an exception to this nonsense.
Right. And are there any laws in India that prohibit interfaith or intercaste marriage for anyone?
No, I don't think so. That's why you have the Special Marriage Act.
Okay. And what are laws that actually protect Dalits and non-Hindus in India?
So there's a 1955 legislation which deals with protection of civil liberties. Then there's a legislation that deals with the prevention of atrocities against the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And then there's Article 17 that deals with the abolition of untouchability. These, off the top of my head, are three legislations which immediately protect this specific group on the basis of caste identity from any kind of atrocity, verbal or physical.
Okay, two viewers, Ramakant Verma and Aditya Bakaya, are both asking about the Uniform Civil Code. Is it really important to enshrine equality within the constitutional framework?
on that, my views are fairly clear, and I've said this before, that unless and until I see the extent of interference of the Uniform Civil Code with Hindu practices and Hindu traditions, I will not be in a position to support it, because the Nehruvian dispensation has encroached enough and infringed enough with the Hindu identity. And I will not trust any dispensation to not interfere with us unless and until I see the document.
Okay.
So that's my basic answer. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So just pivoting a little bit, one claim that has gotten a lot of traction in the West is that Indian Muslims will become stateless because of the CAA and the NRC together. Is something like that even possible, given what we've discussed about the way that equality is enshrined into the Indian Constitution? Is something like that possible within the Indian constitutional framework?
Indian Muslims or Muslims who are Indian citizens can never be made stateless, because a Hindu majority India would never tolerate it. Okay? That's not how Hindus are made. That's not how a Hindu majority country is run. I don't think that will ever happen. But yes, illegal migrants can become stateless, and they are envisaged as stateless. And if those illegal migrants enter the country with a design to create a free living space, or to foment trouble, or to deprive Indians, whether regardless of their faith, of their job opportunities, then I do believe that the Constitution, and there are a number of international instruments that allow them to be treated as stateless citizens, as stateless people. So to answer your question, Indian Muslims will never be stateless. Okay.
I think that's very clarifying for people, because I think this narrative has gotten a lot of traction here, especially in the West. So, right. So one thing that you had mentioned earlier also was within the notion of equality, it's somewhat perverse to introduce all these distinctions between different classes of people, and specifically argue for one class of people having more rights than another class of people. So political theorists in the West have often thought about the ways in which discrimination can be justified. So for example, this was a big thing with John Rawls. So what are the types of discrimination that you think sit within a dharmic framework and sit within the Indian constitutional framework?
So allow me to make this a bit more provocative and controversial. So
always.
When I think 4 prisoners were presented to Duryodhana and Dharmaraja, asking them to dispense justice, and all of them had committed the crime of killing a person. Duryodhana, I think, was more like the queen from Alice in Wonderland. I think Burton's, which are off with their heads. Okay, so that's what his response was. And I think Yudhishthira basically said, I'd like to understand their caste. I'd like to know which caste they come from. And at that stage, I think Shakuni ends up asking the question, what has caste got to do with this? To which Yudhishthira says, if I know for a fact that a certain person comes from a Brahmin community and he is guilty of murder, he must be punished more severely than the rest. Okay, so those who keep spouting uninformed nonsense about Manusmriti and whatnot should actually ask themselves whether these codes of punishment prescribe stringent or more stringent punishments for people coming from so-called upper castes or savarnas. Okay, whether or not there's a concept of an upper caste in the first place. Second, the concept of equality among equals, as practiced in the US, was discussed extensively even before the Fundamental Rights Committee of the Indian Constitution sat together to craft the Constitution. Okay, there was an extensive discussion, and in that they come to the very clear conclusion: when you speak of equality, you speak of equality among similarly placed people. As simple as that. Just as you can't treat a child at the same level as an adult, even when it comes to contractual rights and obligations, that must be the case with other forms of legal application as well. So it is possible in certain instances to use the law to, let's say, prop up or support a certain community if there is a historical basis to lend it that kind of a legal or a constitutional support, which I think is the very bedrock for the caste-based reservation and its justification within the framework of the Constitution. So equality, unfortunately for the left, is too much of a nuanced concept, and I don't think they're capable of understanding it.
Okay, so before we move on to the next section of the interview, I wanted to go to a couple of viewer questions. So a couple of different viewers have now brought up the issue of discrimination against Hindu institutions, specifically mandirs.
Right.
So first of all, why is that important, and in what ways does that happen? I know this is something that you've been working on a lot. And what's the way forward on fighting that?
Can you just repeat the question so that I understand it with greater clarity?
Sure. So Hindu institutions and mandirs are often discriminated against in terms of government control over them.
Right.
So what are the ways in which that manifests itself? And what do you think is the legal path forward in terms of getting those types of restrictions removed?
So it's interesting that this question is being asked in the backdrop of the pandemic, because you'll see any number of progressive, liberal-minded geniuses spouting on social media that all the wealthy temples must surrender their wealth to the government in order for it to meet the expenses that it has to foot as part of this initiative to combat the pandemic. Okay. And these geniuses who also speak of equality don't seem to make the same call with respect to other religious institutions. That somehow limited, that treatment and that special love is limited for Hindu institutions. Okay, that is precisely why I believe that it is important to bust this myth in everybody's heads that the money that belongs to the temple is everybody's money. That belongs to the Hindu community, and most importantly, that belongs to the temple alone. It is the property of the temple. Okay. And the temple, once you've donated something or contributed something to somebody else, it becomes the property of the other person, and it is entirely up to his volition to use it in a manner that he or she deems it fit. Okay, so one of the reasons that I chose to actually commit myself to this particular cause as a lawyer, of course, and not as an activist, is that the treatment and the general misconceptions with respect to the property or ownership of Hindu property is something that needs a lot of cleaning up. There are too many cobwebs in people's minds which end up clouding their judgment. Okay. Under the Constitution, notwithstanding the fact that it's a civilizational constitution, it guarantees autonomy of religious institutions, and Hindu institutions are not an exception to this autonomy. They are to be fundamentally treated as autonomous bodies. Okay. Unfortunately, thanks to the anti-Brahminization of public discourse, the anti-Hinduization of public discourse, and the constant nonsense that is spewed that Hindu institutions are fundamentally and incorrigibly corrupt. Okay. People have begun to assume that the only way to secure a corrupt-free administration of a Hindu body is by allowing the government to take it over. Okay, I'm surprised that a government that you don't trust when it comes to security deals, you trust it when it comes to Hindu temples. I don't understand how that works. Okay, so constitutionally, this is an untenable position. Morally, it is an untenable position. And socially, it is completely unacceptable to deprive a community of the autonomy with respect to its own resources, because I would like to put it to use for my people. I'm very, very clear about it. Okay. And whatever it may sound, however narrow-minded it may sound, if I wish to choose to spend on others, that should come from me. That's a decision that I must take. I can't be forced to give up that property. Okay. Because we are a global minority, we have our own interests, we have our own concerns, and we have a right to use these resources to protect our interest first. I'm happy to give up all temple money, or at least even support it, the day someone tells me that India will be governed by Rajadharma, okay, as we understand it. As long as that does not happen, I will not surrender this money to anyone at all.
There are lots of questions coming in. One question says, Article 17 says untouchability is abolished and its practice in any form is forbidden. The enforcement of any disability arising out of untouchability shall be an offense punishable in accordance with law. Do you think this is very open-ended? What are any forms, considering that one of the judges remarked in the Sabrimala judgment that the tradition was a form of untouchability?
So I've said this before, and I reiterate the position that no constitutional provision must be read to dehorse the context. And Article 17 was crafted and engrafted in the Constitution in the backdrop of caste-based untouchability alone. Extensive discussions in this regard have taken place in the Constituent Assembly debates, whether ritualistic practices which have, let's say, social distancing as part of their setup, would they qualify as untouchability? And the answer is a clear no. Okay, and that's precisely why I believe that the judgment of 28th of September 2018 in the Sabrimala case, the 3-2 judgment, is up for review because this is a central question that we've raised, which is, can you actually call this untouchability? Do you not strike a distinction between a caste-based practice, a birth-based practice, and a ritualistic practice which is temporary in nature, which is designed to meet let's say, the purity requirements of a certain institution. Okay, and in any case, frankly, to use it in the context of Sabarimala is to make the admission that this is because, in fact, somebody was making this statement, I think, at the Earth Festival, that the blood that flows in my veins is the same blood that effectively it's the same as the menstrual blood. I think that's a scientifically incorrect statement. I don't think there's any basis for it, because menstrual blood is different in its contents from the blood that flows in. So I was actually aghast at it. I just kept my mouth shut. But the point I'm trying to make is practices in any temple are based on rituals and maintenance of sanctity of the energy, sanctity of the place. Okay. So in fact, someone I follow regularly for his updates and for his thoughts on spirituality, Rajarshi Nandi, put out a fantastic post on Facebook a few days ago, where he said, the temple does not exist for people to come and pray. In fact, the temple exists because a place is chosen for the residence of an energy form for the benefit of the entire society. So even if one person doesn't visit the temple continues to retain its relevance because its presence itself is meant to sanctify the population or the place. Okay. Yeah. So anybody who says that it's a public temple, therefore I have a right to enter it, sorry, not done, not happening. That's neither supported by religion nor is it supported by constitution.
There are a ton of great questions, but we're going to move on to the next section, and which sort of pivots back to this US-India comparison. Are there laws governing hate speech in India? Just as a basic question.
There are provisions which deal with the concept of hurting of religious sentiments or inciting passions against a certain community, which have been ultimately interpreted as the same, I mean, they've been interpreted in the same lines as hate speech laws in the US, largely citing US judgments, that as long as a certain act or a certain statement does not actively incite people to commit violence, physical violence, it is not hate speech. Okay? Because ultimately there must be room for criticism, there must be room for dialogue, there must be room for inquiry. Okay? If ultimately I wish to assume for a moment that somebody wishes to convert to Hinduism or convert out of Hinduism, wouldn't they want to critique, examine, and ask themselves the pros and cons of doing so? And asking themselves, this new faith, what does it present which is better than Hinduism? Is it possible for them to do so without asking the harshest of questions? Because that's going to be an entire change of worldview, an entire change of lifestyle and practices. Okay, so there are laws which forbid, which deter, and which punish and penalize hate speech, and it's largely limited to speech that incites violence.
Is there any way to argue that predatory conversion is violence?
Predatory conversion or fraudulent conversion is against public order. That argument has been made and accepted by the Supreme Court. Okay, which is why the anti-conversion laws of Madhya Pradesh and Odisha, when they were challenged by a Christian missionary, surprise, surprise, ultimately were upheld for being constitutional by the US Supreme Court on the ground that the right to practice is not the right to convert. Okay, so the right to practice your faith is not the right to convert. And if it happens to be a central pillar of your faith, then it must yield to public order, because at the end of the day, aggressive conversion or attempts to convert lead to social friction and could therefore lead to a law and order situation. That's the law of the land.
Okay. So we're going to go back to caste and race again for a moment. In the US, African Americans were subjected to legalized discrimination through black codes and system of Jim Crow and other forms of disenfranchisement. Right. We wanted to ask whether similar systems of oppression exist within the application of the Indian constitutional framework. Are there any laws that actively privilege, Brahmins or other upper caste people and actively disprivilege Dalits or non-Hindus vis-a-vis, specifically, I've seen this, ownership of land and property, the right to defend and protect, the right to organize and resist, education, criminal punishment system, any of that?
A resounding no, not at all. If anything, the provisions of the Constitution which envisage affirmative action have been used to specifically benefit certain religious communities without historical justification, without economic justification, without social justification, to the detriment of and at the expense of others.
Okay, that was pretty clear. Are there any other questions from the comments that we want to take?
Yeah, so one question that's coming in about affirmative action, since you mentioned it a lot, is specifically reservations and the way that they disproportionately benefit, especially within the context of university scholarships, students from the scheduled caste community. So what do you think should be a better system of getting diversity in educational systems without having these types of quotas?
I think my position on this is publicly available. I support caste-based reservation for the foreseeable future. Okay, because I don't think we have achieved what we wanted to, but I certainly believe that a ceiling is warranted in the form of a creamy layer ceiling. Okay, but a caste-based reservation is needed for multiple reasons. Among other things, that's the one tool that helps you prevent or at least stem conversion to some extent. Okay, to be as blunt as possible. So I don't see the point in giving up this tool at all. And more than anything, I would certainly put my faith in the, let's say, the good sense in certain communities which come to the conclusion at a later point that they don't need this crutch or this tool anymore. Okay. And I think some communities, so for instance, let's be very clear, reservations in educational institutions benefit only those who are in a position to aspire for education. Okay. So people living in rural centers may not be the beneficiaries of reservation at all. Ultimately, it ends up benefiting the urban population more than the rural population. That divide still exists. So the existence of a certain SOP doesn't translate to you being the beneficiary of that SOP unless and until you reach that threshold. If education is not even a priority or a possibility given the circumstances you live in, of what use is this reservation, right? So that's one. Second, I don't think we should ever run away from the fact, and it would be dishonest to run away from the fact that caste-based discrimination still exists in certain places in India. That's something that even I don't think I will ever be able to defend or ignore. Okay, so as long as that exists, some kind of a structure that levels the playing field must exist, because it is the society's way of saying that every caste identity is equally valid, and every member of every caste has a right to subscribe to the practices of his caste and be proud of his heritage. And there's no reason for one to look down upon the other. And that is the central message that the caste-based reservation sends out, without killing the concept of a caste. If anything, it engenders the concept of caste.
There's one question that I think it pivots back to the CAA that I think is worth asking. The question is, can and should CAA have not been extended to persecuted Muslim minorities in other South Asian communities as well?
See, this question, I think three propositions, I have to spell them out at the outset. One, when it comes to citizenship and migration and naturalization, every state has the sovereign right to determine who enters its borders and what qualifications they satisfy. And I don't see how religion cannot be one of those metrics. It is possible. It is relevant, particularly in the neighborhood that India exists. It is extremely relevant, okay? Because religion has been the basis of persecution of Hindus in our neighborhood. Therefore, it is impossible to turn a blind eye to religion as a metric. Anybody who asks us to do so fundamentally lacks proportion and a sense of history, okay? Three, India has not shut its doors to persecuted Muslims in the neighborhood. They are still allowed to apply. They are still entitled to apply. The only difference between the beneficiaries of the CAA and these routine applicants would be the amount of time that they would have to spend in India for them to be naturalized. Okay. Previously, it was 11 years for these beneficiaries of the CAA. That period has been reduced to 5 years. That's the only distinction. Other than that, there is no distinction. And I don't think anybody who makes this allegation has even bothered to read the 3-page document called the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, which is just written in crystal clear language in black and white. I don't think there's a problem in reading it at all. It's very, very straightforward. Okay. So one, India has not shut its doors, but if India deems it fit to shut its doors on someone, it has a right to, as a sovereign state, if it believes that they cannot be trusted, and to err on the side of caution, it's better to shut our doors.
Great, thank you for that. It's very clear and needed to be stated just like that. Yeah. So I am aware that it's very late for you and appreciate that you have joined us for so long. I do want to reassure people who are watching that we have convinced J Sai Deepak ji to join us for a second session, which is very exciting. So maybe we can even take up some of the questions that were not addressed or that might come in later. And we have some other topics for a second session, so we'll let you know about that, possibly in a time that's more amenable to our West Coast friends. Is there anything else that either of you wants to say before we say goodbye for now?
I just want to say thank you, and I hope to keep my answers shorter than the next session.
No, you're very, very great.
No, they were perfect.
One last thing, this video will be available on Facebook. It's gonna stay up. Don't worry, it's not going anywhere if you weren't able to join live or if you just jumped in. And we're also gonna try to post a higher res version on either Facebook or on possibly also YouTube. And in addition to that, several of you have asked about the resources that you can help read to better understand some of the issues that J Sai Deepak ji brought up. One resource that we found really helpful was his own writing on these subjects. So you can read him at Open the Magazine. His articles are all up there, and we'll post further writings that were mentioned in this interview in the comments section of the Facebook video.
There are also some wonderful interviews with him on Upward that are really illuminating and crystal clear in terms of interpreting, especially some of the more recent legislation and some demystifying a lot of it. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Namaste.
Namaste.